Opportunity of having the Smith brothers here to talk to you about our growing up in Myrtle Beach, about our parents, and about the articles Dad wrote on the history of Myrtle Beach. I'm Mark, I'm the oldest, but Frank's the middle child, and David's the baby over here. Our parents, Marcus and Frankie Smith, aren't with us anymore, but they're still a part of us. But Mom's sister, Mary Bowie, she's trying to hide. We call her Aunt BB, only because when I was a baby I couldn't say Mary, so it came out BB, and she's been stuck with that ever since. And if you look at her, that's what Mom would have looked like about now. So you have some idea of how Mom would look. She's not going to stand up. I've written down my thoughts just so I won't forget to cover something, but you'll have to excuse me if I periodically use my reading glasses. You would think that having a father and a brother in the eye business, I wouldn't have this problem. It's age. I didn't put that in there. I gave you. Don't stick that one in so you wouldn't know that.
I don't wear glasses.
We grew up in this great small town that's now grown into a resort. We were all born in Conway because there was no hospital here. And we came to this library a lot during our school years. In fact, in the summertime, we came here for day camp. And I was talking to Lester Sue earlier. We were probably here in the parking lot. The building was a little bit farther in. We'd come and we'd have paddle ball games. We'd go over to the park and play on all the different rides that you couldn't do anymore, like the merry-go-round, or what do you call that now? I guess that's it.
In the pool.
In the pool. So we had a great time growing up here in Myrtle Beach. And a little bit of family history. We're the 8th generations of Smiths to be in the Marion, Horry County area. Obviously, our family doesn't move very far. I've traced our Smith family line to John and Mary Smith. Just imagine that. John moved to Marion County in about 1740. And Mom grew up in Conway. Mom and Dad did. Mom was a Johnson. She told us many times she had 81 first cousins. So you have to be careful in Horry County on how you talk about people, because you could well be related to them. Our dad wrote many articles over the years about Myrtle Beach and Conway. A number of them were printed in the Sun News. And Dad and I worked for several years on planning and trying to put together a book. And I finally finished getting it published in August. And Dad would have liked to have been here, because he loved to talk and he loved people, so he would have loved to have been given this talk instead of the three of us. But we'll talk about Mom and Dad for a few minutes, and then talk about the articles he wrote, and then a little bit about the history of Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach natives and longtime residents can reminisce with us, and the rest of you can learn a little bit more about the history of Myrtle Beach. We have a lot of snowbirds with us today. We appreciate y'all coming out and taking your time from your travels to learn more about the area. I think that's really a nice way to travel, to get to know people and how the history of the city was. Mom and Dad grew up back door to back door in Conway. They married in 1950, and they moved to the beach. There was an old story that Dad always said Mom's family was better off than his family, so he'd go in the backyard and antagonize Mom across the fence, and they had coal on the ground for some reason, and she would throw coal at Dad. And he'd take it inside and use it to help heat the house. So they grew up as childhood sweethearts. He was an optometrist by profession, and his office was originally in the Arcade building, right next to the Methodist Church on 9th Avenue. It's now Woody's Barber Shop. It was Dad's office. It was a tiny little thing. I don't know how he did it. Frank's in the optometric business, and like it wasn't. It was a tiny little space. But he later moved to an office on Oak Street, and he was a youth counselor at the Methodist Church for the Methodist Youth Fellowship, MYF. And he did it for many years. He probably did it for 16 or 18 years in the 50s and 60s. And he loved that. All the kids would just keep him young, and he always had practical jokes he played, but he was serious about studying with them. And they would come over to the house, and they would have parties in our backyard. One of our favorite memories is we'd be peeking out the window, these little heads popping up, and these teenagers were in the backyard, and they were eating watermelons and spitting seeds at each other and running around. We said, those crazy teenagers. I'm sure we did some of that too.
Simple fun then.
Dad was very active in the JCs, and the JCs sponsored the Miss South Carolina pageant for 8 years during the 50s. Dad and Bill Sigmund, Bill Gaspy, and many others were involved in these pageants. And one year, Leanne Merriweather, Miss America 1955, came to one of the pageants. And we have a picture of her holding me in her arms in our front yard back in 1955, 56. Mom and Dad were at all of our activities over the years, particularly sporting events. There always seemed to be a Little League game going on Oak Street, right behind the high school, which is now Kmart, right across the street. So we still refer to that as Kmart High. Unfortunately, it's gone. The high school baseball games were also in that area. The SCB&T branch would have been center field if you look back from where Kmart is. And the old high school, Myrtle Beach High School gym, where we played basketball along with the Brittons. Clay Britton's here. He was one of our teammates and classmates. And Ernie Neal would coach there. In fact, I think Myrtle Beach won the state championship. I think it was back in 1962. Ernie Neal was the coach. It's all part of the Kmart property. And the former Myrtle Beach High School football field is where the Chamber of Commerce building now sits on Oak Street and 13th. As we're talking about football, I also, Alvin Burundi was the coach of Myrtle Beach High School football team back in 1968, 69, I think it was Elton. He's at the back, he snuck in. And he later went to Furman University and coached baseball there. But after some of the games, we would have dinner at Brandt's Hamburgers. No longer here, but 3rd Avenue South and Highway 17.
And that was like, that was like a treat. It's like we get in the car and pack it up and head to Brandt's. It was like you're going to Columbia. It was like way on the south end, but it was only, what, 3rd South?
Yeah, 3rd South.
That was like a treat for us. That place was fantastic. Anybody in here ever go to Brandt's?
Oh, yeah, we go. 19-cent hamburgers. And they're just flatten out the buns right there for you.
And the best milkshake.
Oh, yeah. Well, Dad loved both Myrtle Beach and Conway, and he enjoyed learning and writing about the histories of each. Dad's mother's family, the Rosses from Ansonville, North Carolina, had an oceanfront cottage about 22nd Avenue and Ocean Boulevard. And growing up, Dad would spend a lot of his summers there. They also went down to Myrtle's Inlet, where he loved crabbing and fishing in the inlet. As I said, Dad wrote many articles for the Sun News over the years. Most of them were about life in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Blanche Floyd, a good family friend who also wrote articles for the Sun News, as well as some books, would proofread Dad's articles. And Dad said she would mark them up in red as only a school teacher could. Blanche taught South Carolina history at the junior high school, which is now the intermediate school on Oak Street.
I have.
And a lot of people in here, Danny Anderson's back in the back. He was in my class. He had Miss Floyd as well. Dad started out working on his old trusty typewriter. Was it a Royal? You remember it was a Royal?
I still got it.
You have it? But he finally moved to a word processor and then to a computer and worked on Word Perfect. I finally got him to move to Microsoft Word, and he hated it. He loved his Word Perfect, but for me to be able to do anything with the articles, I really needed to have it in Word, because the Sun News would only take it in Word. So we worked on his articles, and he had a number of articles. A lot of them I didn't use in the book, but he had different versions. We'd pull up one, it might be 4 versions of the book, of that article. It was like, why do you have 4? But he'd start one, then he'd start another, then I eventually had to take those and blend them and get the whole article together. Unfortunately, the last couple of years he wasn't able to focus on the project, and I told him I would finish up the book and get it published. Be careful what you promise, because it weighs heavy on the conscience for years. And again, it took 5.5 years to do it. Here's the book we finally put together. The cover was from a painting by Dixie Dugan. It's got a wraparound of the old pavilion in Peach's Corner. And in fact, we have the original painting in our living room, and it was my wife's idea, Sherry sitting here on the front row, to use the painting on the cover. And to me, it's Myrtle Beach. And Dad collected a lot of Dixie's paintings. In fact, he traded glasses for art over the years. We have a number of those. I think Frank and David got some too. So we have a lot of Dixie's paintings. Jack Thompson was also very generous in offering some of his photographs to be used in the book. Dad and Jack talked for several years about using his photographs to put in the book. So I met with Jack a few times before I got the book finished and talked to him about the photos. And I learned a lot more about Myrtle Beach. I thought I knew a lot, but I learned a lot more with Jack, particularly about the history of the Seaside Inn. It was built in like 1901. It was up near Highway 17, near the old Flatiron Building, which is no longer there. Used to be the Colonial Building, which is no longer there. And then it was a Hydra Surge for the Pavilion Amusement Park, no longer there. But it's really between 8th and 9th Avenue on Highway 17. And I found out that later, part of the hotel was moved down to 8th Avenue and the Boulevard. And they kind of took the building and ended up rolling it, I think, on timber, on logs, all the way down to the Boulevard and turned it 90 degrees from where it originally sat. Because the old Seaside Inn had a long boardwalk going from like Highway 17 all the way to the pavilion down there. And Jimmy Benton's father was integral in that process of moving that building. Back to the book for a second. Dad and I set it up in chapters by decade so you could see and feel the growth of Myrtle Beach as history progressed. And of course, Myrtle Beach wouldn't be possible without some history and stories on Conway. Dad's articles covered the history of Myrtle Beach from his experiences, from local sources, and also from conversations with others. And he loved to talk to people. Loved to do that. He was also a member of the Horry County Historical Society, and he got a lot of his information from that group. And I talked to Susan McMillan recently, and they bought a book and sold it, gave it to Tommy Abbott, and he's an attorney. He's the chairman of the Historical Society, so we'll probably be talking with them, giving a talk to them at some point in the future. But I also decided to add short biographies of Mom and Dad in each of the chapters, adding to Dad's personal experiences. His grandfather's name was Pop. That's what his father was called, was Pop. He was very much a people person. To my two boys, he knew everybody, and everybody knew him. So when we would go out as a family and I'd start talking to people, our sons would say, "You're a Pop wannabe." That's not such a bad thing. He wrote on a number of topics, and I'll go over a few of them with you. Some of you know more about the history of Myrtle Beach than we do, but I just want to go over some of the things. Some of these are no longer with us, but I still want to take you down memory lane a little bit. The Ocean Forest Hotel. It was called the $1 Million Hotel. It opened in January of 1930. The Woodside brothers developed it, and they were from Greenville. They bought 66,000 acres from Myrtle Beach Farms in the 1920s to develop it. They also developed the Ocean Forest Country Club, which is called Pine Lakes Country Club now. In the 50s, the ballroom served as a stage for the Circle Theater, which brought Broadway plays to Myrtle Beach. I had my junior senior prom at Ocean Forest, and they imploded it Friday the 13th, 1974. I'm sorry those of you who weren't here at the time missed that, because it was a beautiful.
I mean, you want to pass this around?
I just leave it up here.
All right, y'all look at this later. There's some good pictures of Ocean Forest being imploded. And have y'all seen this book? It was put up by Coastal Federal several years ago. Has a bunch of old pictures of Myrtle Beach in it. I can leave it up here afterwards if anybody wants to look through it. It's got some really neat photos, especially one. That's a little bit. A lot of people look at that book.
And you were telling me, I didn't know this, that Dad had some optometric.
Yeah, we have a conference meeting every February now, but at that time, that was the first year they ever had it. The Southern Regional Optometric Society meeting was at the Ocean Forest. I don't know what year that was. It had to have been in the late 40s. The first year they ever had it was in Myrtle Beach, so now it's held in Atlanta, but it was at the Ocean Forest, the very first one.
Next thing I've got is a Washington Park racetrack. It had horse racing. It opened in 1938. It's located right beside the Wells Fargo building on Oak Street. And if you ever look at some views on Google Maps or anything, you can almost make out the oval of the racetrack. It's over there in the woods. It was harness racing at the time.
There was a go-kart track there at one time too, wasn't it?
Was it after they closed it down?
I think it was a go-kart track.
Yeah, the go-kart was there in the late 50s, early 60s.
Okay.
Right on the bank there.
Yeah, that's right.
It closed after the 1941 season, having to do with pari-mutuel betting. It did open back up in 1945 to 47 for thoroughbred racing. And the steel grandstands were moved to the Myrtle Beach Speedway after the track closed. The Myrtle Beach Pavilions, there have been 3 of them. All of them come and go. In 1901, the first one was built in conjunction with the Seaside Inn. In 1923, a new wooden 2-story pavilion replaced the old one. This pavilion burned down December of 1944. In 1949, a new pavilion opened. And at one point, the doors were opened up when Hurricane Hazel came through to let the floodwaters go through the building instead of damaging the building. Frank and I worked at the pavilion for several summers during our college years in the Magic Attic, teenage nightclub. I also worked as a lifeguard on the beach, and many of our friends worked at the pavilion just like we did. You didn't pay very much, but we could get as many hours as we wanted.
I'll just say real quick, I remember my senior year of college, I went to Erskine College, and I was going to college that day, that morning. It was Labor Day Monday, and Mark was working at the pavilion. I remember, we lived on Pine Lakes Drive at the time, around 46th Avenue. I remember driving from the house to see Mark say goodbye before I went. I didn't encounter a car the entire way to the pavilion, meaning that, at that time at Labor Day, everything shut down.
Yeah.
And how it's changed nowadays, but that was in 77, September 77.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking of Pine Lake Drive, Harriet Hood,
Dear friend.
was with us today. Yeah, they were about several houses down from us on 48th and Pine Lake Drive. Another structure, the Patricia Inn. It was a grand white 3-story building with green and white awnings at 28th Avenue North, oceanfront to the beach. If you want to get an idea of what it looks like, you can look at the BNC Bank building on 38th Avenue in Grissom. That gives you an idea. That's what they were trying to recapture, was the white building with the awnings. They tore that down in 1985.
Yeah, we can mention the Chesterfield Inn too for Clay. We see Clay back there. He's intimately was with the Chesterfield Inn. I worked there for 3 summers for his dad, and that's another landmark that's no longer here either, unfortunately. A lot of y'all remember that place, don't you?
I remember, can I
Go ahead.
something? With the Patricia Inn, and probably your family did the same thing, but we had an ice storm back in the 70s. Y'all remember the ice storm 72?
Yeah, I think it was 72.
And our family, of course, nobody had any power at all. And our family ended up going to Patricia and stayed for the week. They opened up their doors, Clay. I'm sure your family did the same thing with y'all's hotels as well. But they opened up the Patricia. We all got to stay there. It was wonderful because the downstairs, the restaurant, they served family style. And so you got to go down and eat with all your friends, because all your friends and their families were staying there as well. So what was a very hard time, I'm sure more for adults, because they couldn't do anything. For us kids, we just had a blast during the ice storm.
We've had
We went to the Yachtsman, and that's the best hot bath I've ever had in my life. I love a hot tub. In Britain, she loved it. Anyway, I should have gone over there with my parents.
Another special one to us was the arcade lunchroom. It was located in the same arcade building where Dad's office was, at the other end of the breezeway. And it was owned by John and Felicia Gravis, Polish and Greek immigrants, limited English speaking. And Dad's job each day, along with visiting and having coffee with them, was to check their menu board on the wall. One day they had corned beef and garbage. He had to change that to cabbage. And another day they had stink beans. Should have been string, but so that was Dad's job, and he loved it too. Guest and boarding houses were here in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in Myrtle Beach, and the Couch was one of them. George Navenant is no longer with us. He rented from Mrs. R.C. Couch. He had one called the Welcome Inn and the Thomas Manor. I think Dad stayed at Thomas Manor when he came to the beach before he got married. And after Hurricane Hazel, the boarding houses just kind of went away and modern hotels came into play. Hurricane Hazel big time in Myrtle Beach. It kind of changed us forever. It was October 15th, 1954, 3 weeks before I was born. And again, there was no hospital in Myrtle Beach, so everybody was watching Hurricane Hazel, and all of a sudden it took a turn that night, headed right toward us. And so there was no number of the emergency team that were running door to door telling people, and Alan Erickson came by our house and told Mom and Dad they better get moving to Conway because the bridge might go out. At the time it was a drawbridge. It's the one you see that's stuck straight up in the air right now, that's been that way forever. So Mom and Dad took off for Conway early in the middle of the night. 3 weeks later I came, but it wasn't that night. Dad told us he remembered driving to Conway. Now, that was 501. It had only been in existence a few years, but he said he had to drive with his head outside the window because he couldn't see through the windshield.
They had more damage in Conway than Dad had at the house.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a Category 4 storm when it hit Myrtle Beach, 130 miles per hour. There was a wooden oceanfront boardwalk that was floated out to sea. It used to go up to 27th Avenue North. That'd be wonderful if the city could just continue extending the boardwalk on up the north side and to the south side as well. Mr. Joe White. Dad met Joe in 1947 when he opened up his office in the arcade building. Joe shined shoes at several places, primarily at the arcade barbershop. And Mrs. McKnight's here. Her husband cut our hair back in the day at the arcade building. But Joe would shine shoes there. He always rode his bicycle. He never drove a car. And he honked his horn. He would smile and wave at everybody. And the city of Myrtle Beach honored him by renaming 10th Avenue to Mr. Joe White Avenue. We had some theaters here in Myrtle Beach. The Gloria was on 9th Avenue, no longer here. It was a short block from the boulevard. It was built in 1937. The Rivoli was fancy. It opened in 1958. And it's still there in presence, but that was a special place.
We used to go, Saturday mornings were, if you all remember this, you could go take 7 bottle caps. And that was your admission to get into the movie. Anybody remember that? 7 bottle caps. So we would ride sometimes with Dad to the office. Anybody remember Benfield's Esso station, which is where Maryland Fried Chicken is? We would go around there, we'd get the bottle caps out of the machine and go across to the movies at 10ish or so, and then the movie was over. Mom would either pick us up or we'd go back to Dad's office and wait for him to get through and ride home with him. So that was our Saturday mornings.
That's big stuff.
That was. Our Saturday morning entertainment.
There was also a drive-in at the north end of the beach that I don't remember at all, but Dad talked about it in his articles. It's called the Flamingo Drive-In. It was up at Northwoods. There was another one at the south end of Myrtle Beach, 13th Avenue South, at the Big Lot Shopping Center. And it was near the former Winks Drive-In, which is no longer with us. It was a hangout for teenagers at the time. And we went to that theater many times in our pajamas, because as soon as the movie was over, they'd take us back home and plop us in bed, and we were gone.
Yeah.
Frank was talking the other day about remembering the Parent Trap when it came out.
The original movie, we saw it at that drive-in. I remember that.
Anything else y'all have on specific places? Hopefully they got notes too.
No, the other one was where anybody know what was previously the Myrtle Square Mall, what was there before Myrtle Square Mall? A lot of people, before Myrtle Square Mall, there was a driving range, and then there was a putt-putt course called, I think, Jungle Golf, right on the road, and then there was a par 3 on the south side of the driving range. And that's why, if you'd ever played that par 3, you got to the back of the course, you could see the oval track from where the horse racing was, because it was back in the western part of that course. So yeah, that whole plot of area there was par 3, a driving range, and a putt-putt. And then next to that on Highway 17 was the Hickory House. Anybody remember that? That was another famous little place in town. So all that was in that one little area.
Then came Puck's, I believe Puck's Drive-In. Anybody remember that?
Yeah, so that was there for a long time before they tore it down to build a mall, which is no longer there. Now there's nothing there.
That's where the city dump was, right behind the
They were right
drive-in.
behind Oak Street.
Where BB&T is, that was the
The
city
old city
dump.
dump
That's where they dumped all the traffic.
in Burn.
Yeah.
You think of any other places?
No, only other thing, well, Chapin Company, when we went shopping, you went to Chapin Company. I mean, that was your one stop. Myrtle Beach didn't have much for shopping. If we didn't go to Chapin, we went to Florence or Wilmington, but yeah, Chapin Company, you could hit about everything there, and that, I guess, until Belk came, remember the first Belk was on 9th Avenue, but before that was just Chapin, or you go to Florence to shop. So
They would deliver groceries. You could order your groceries, and Junior Bellamy, they called them Frock. I don't know why. You know that?
Yeah, and I think it was at the Patrick's presentation about a month ago, they were talking about Chapin's, and as kids or young teenagers, you could, when you got your license, you could go in there, buy some clothes, charge it to dad, charge it to mom. They knew who you were. You just wrote your name and you charged it, and off you went. Oh, the old days.
Yeah, they financed a lot of people's houses. You could charge lumber, build your house, and Chapin Company would finance it. Remember that?
Now I'd like to give a real brief overview of the history of Myrtle Beach. Some of you probably know this, but I'll just give you some dates and some events. In 1900, a contest was held to name the resort village, we were called Newtown at the time. And it was named Myrtle Beach based on the abundance of wax myrtles in the area. In 1901, Burroughs and Chapin built a store on 9th Avenue, and it housed the first Myrtle Beach post office, which replaced the old Withers post office. In 1912, Myrtle Beach Farms Company was formed, and Simeon B. Chapin and the Burroughs families went together with that one. 1936, they dug the Intracoastal Waterway, which probably changed Myrtle Beach and Conway forever. In 1938, as you know, Myrtle Beach incorporated as a city. 1948, Highway 501 was built from Conway to Myrtle Beach with a drawbridge we talked about. And the former road from Conway to Myrtle Beach before 501 went through Red Hill in Conway, pretty much the route of 544 going to Socastee, and then on the Highway 15 in Myrtle Beach. And it came in on Broadway Street. The highway was severed at one point later. Does anybody know why? It was a runway for the airport, that's right. So the old 15 would run, years past, run right to where Harrelson is now, and the road would just continue on at that point. But they redirected that because of the runway. 1954, Hurricane Hazel. In the early 60s, the current 501 bridge was built over the Intracoastal Waterway. Anything else you want to add? Anybody else?
Somebody was supposed to add something.
Well, what I'd like to do is, I've talked about Dad's book, but there's one article in particular that kind of captures his love for the inlet and the area. And pardon me, I just read through the article. It gives a bit of his style of writing for this. And it was called Let's Go Crabbing. And he remembered the swash from his preteen years in the late 30s. My parents loaded several crab nets in a bushel basket into the old four-door black Ford. Leaving Conway, we headed for Myrtle Beach on the long, winding road. Approaching Socastee, we passed the Methodist Church. The sandy road with deep ruts branched off to Myrtle's Inlet, where we often spent afternoons crabbing from the weather-worn piers. We stayed on the paved road and passed the Socastee School and continued our trip to the beach for a fun-filled crabbing afternoon at Singleton Swash. Singleton Swash is where the Dunes Club is right now. The remaining 9 miles seemed short. On Kings Highway, the present southbound lane was the only paved road. It ended at the entrance of the Ocean Forest Hotel, which was demolished in '74. As we circled the majestic castle-like structure, my father commented, "This is called the $1 Million Hotel." My mother replied, "Costs $5 for one night's lodging." In front of the hotel, a rough sandy entrance led to the beach. We had checked the tide table, and it was 1 hour before low tide. We had a beautiful drive as we headed north on the Strand. Nature dominated the beachfront. The cooling, salty sea breeze provided air conditioning. The roar of the motor frightened hundreds of seagulls, but they found refuge above the breakers until we passed. 2 miles later, we drove across the shallow, watery mouth of Singleton Swash, which George Washington crossed in 1791 on his southern tour. Climbing the huge sand dunes was like ascending small mountains. Cumulus white clouds drifted lazily in a blue summer sky. Once at the top, amid seagrass and sea oats, we looked down on the flowing blue-gray water. Seagulls circled the marsh area. Egrets and herons waded in the shallow water searching for fish. The inlet extended slightly south, and the longer northern end curved and moved inland. Green marsh grass fringed the back borders. We could see the ebb tide was near. Crabs moved swiftly in the shallow water which flowed into the mouth of the Swash. With 3 nets in action, it did not take long to scoop up a basket full of large blue-shelled crabs as they moved out with the tide. We put the live crabs and gear in the trunk of the car. We left at low tide, driving through shallow water again. As I looked through the rearview mirror, I saw Singleton Swash gradually fade from view. Before me, the ocean forest appeared taller and taller as we approached the exit from the beach. The humming of the motor, the swishing of the tires, and the refreshing salt air always made me sleepy. As we traveled home, crabs stirred and scratched in the basket. The sounds awakened me to thoughts of good eating and future crabbing trips. Again, thanks again to Lesta Sue and the Chapin Library for letting us speak about our remembrances of Myrtle Beach, Mom and Dad, and the history of the beach. Does anybody have any questions?